The Pelicans might be very interested in drafting Scoot Henderson, and they may be willing to include Zion Williamson or Brandon Ingram in a deal. But there are limits and complications to making a trade actually happen. Let's see and look at what those breaking points are, and no, other teams aren't getting into the mix either. It's the Thursday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Thursday, looking more at a potential Pelicans trade as we're hearing more and more about everything around a potential deal for Scoot Henderson, a guy that seems they are very high on and looking to draft up and get. But it's not just that simple. There's complications to this. There's breaking points. There's limits. And that might mean a deal doesn't happen. And so I want to look at that in today's show and also let you know that, no, other teams aren't going to get into the mix. Keep in mind what specifically is happening here. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today, every day. We're here Monday through Friday, every day of the week, weekday, and no one else comes to you like this breaking down the biggest stories. If you're an everydayer, if you're someone who listens Monday through Friday, none of this is surprising to you. So make sure you know what's going on with the team. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Follow along on YouTube. And if you want to support the channel other than becoming an everydayer, comment down below on YouTube. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. So let's start with this. There's only two options for the Pelicans to trade with and move either Zion Williamson or Brandon Ingram. And that is the Charlotte Hornets or the Portland Trailblazers. That's it. No other teams are getting into the mix. If people want to do shows about that, talk about that, that's fine. Not going to happen. I'm here to tell you right now that is not going to happen. The Pelicans are not open for sale. They're not shopping Zion Williamson. They're not shopping Brandon Ingram. They're not even necessarily looking to get rid of either of those two players. If you've been listening to the show for a while now, and if you haven't, I urge you to go back and listen to a couple of the old shows when I talk about why maybe a deal would get done for Scoot Henderson. And it comes down to three things. They really like Scoot Henderson. He's basically another number one overall pick in this draft. They're going to have to break up this core eventually, but they don't have to do it now. If you do it sooner rather than later, you get more leverage though. And maybe they're a little sick of Zion Williamson and the stuff going on around him always. And maybe they have concerns about Brandon Ingram too. But that's it. You remove one of those variables. If you take Scoot Henderson out of the equation, neither of those two players are getting moved. Simple as that. This has more to do with Scoot Henderson and all of those factors all lining up. And it kind of falls apart if you remove one of them away. So the Houston Rockets, not going to happen. I saw someone be like, oh, the Indiana Pacers would be awesome to pair Zion Williamson with Tyrese Halliburton and Miles Turner. One, if you're trading Zion Williamson, Halliburton is going to be in that deal, and so will Miles Turner. I mean, like, come on. And two, there's no way that they're going to trade him to Indiana for anything. Because Indiana, unless they have the second overall pick, and right now, that's Charlotte, and then maybe three with the Portland Trailblazers, are the people who are going to get a deal done. New Orleans knows they were first in the West at one point this year. In December, and you don't win an NBA title in December, but they know they were top three going into January, and Brandon Ingram had already missed a number of games, and Zion Williamson was healthy, and they were good. This team knows they're good. You heard JJ Redick on ESPN yesterday saying this team is just health away from being in contention, from getting out of the first round of the playoffs, maybe making a run to the Western Conference Finals. We see it. The team's good. Guys are growing. Herb Jones found his three-point shot at the end of the season. Trey Murphy is looking like he's going to be a solid starter, if not borderline all-star in the future. The team was great defensively. CJ was banged up. He'll be healthy next year and playing better. This team is good. There's no need to do anything right now unless the exact right deal comes across. And that's going to get into what we're going to look at when we look at potential deals with Charlotte and then the Portland Trailblazers in the remainder of today's show. They're not actively shopping anyone and being like, we're listening to offers for Zion or for BI. They're not looking to get off of either of those two guys. They would be fine going into next season with this team intact if that's what it ends up coming to. And honestly, that's more likely than not. Doesn't mean they won't make a trade, though. You know, they're still catering to Zion Williamson with the restructuring of the player performance performance and care team, whatever its title is. They're still very much, in the words of Howard Beck, recent guest of the show, want to be in the Zion Williamson business. So they're trying to do that. Now, if the exact right, perfect trade comes along, okay, we'll get out of that. We'll do what we need to. But they could just run everything back next year and then decide if they need to trade somebody. You know, they could also just offer Brandon Ingram an extension or signs Brandon Ingram to an extension. And when this team gets too expensive and you have to break it up, I mean, the odd man out, and we did a show on this, is CJ McCollum. You can wait and just trade CJ in a year or two. It doesn't have to be Zion Williamson or Brandon Ingram. And honestly, that's as much fun as it is to talk about this, and you kind of always get excited about the new, the shiny thing, which is what Scoot Henderson is, right? The unknown, the draft pick, could be anything. The most likely scenario is you're just going to see the same team here next year, and okay, we didn't need to worry about this in all actuality. Although talks, are happening, though I don't think anything like very, very serious is going on here. But they're not actively shopping either. I think if Scoot Henderson's on the table and the rest of the package isn't too much, it's kind of take your pick. I think they'd prefer to trade BI over Zion Williamson, but I think they'd be willing to include either as long as the trade was the right trade. And that's the key here. Because they like their team, because they aren't in it's not like anything's going to happen next season if they don't trade one of these guys or even trade CJ. And it's not like you're making a move for Bradley Beal here. They'd be fine running it back. So they're not going to completely overpay if they don't have to. And that's where I think things get really interesting, because that might mean trade talks break down depending on what the asking price is and what teams are willing to do. And I think there's a limit to everybody involved in this sort of thing. So let's look at the Charlotte Hornets. Who's coming over to New Orleans in a trade? What does that all look like? Those things are going to be really important when it comes to a potential deal. Let's take a look at that coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Before we get to that, though, today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the place for last-minute ticket deals. You don't need to be stressed out if you're all of a sudden trying to find tickets to a concert that you want to go to a basketball game that you want to go to, because Game Time is super easy to use, and they have deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. And you can get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, comedy, theater, concerts, everything. And the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Bored on a Friday night? Get on the Game Time app, see what's going on in your city, in New Orleans, and get a deal on tickets, and then all of a sudden, it's an awesome weekend. So download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, giving you what you need to know about this team, whether it's draft prospects. We'll get back into that maybe by the end of the week, maybe the beginning of next week. This is creeping up on me here, and we've got a lot to cover, a lot to talk about. Or the Scoot Henderson news, which we've been talking about repeatedly for a little while now. So make sure you become an everydayer, never miss an episode, and you're going to know what's going on with the Pelicans. Tell a friend to do that as well, so they're not asking you stupid questions, dumb questions. Trust me, you should have seen my DMs the past couple of days. Charlotte Hornets are not moving off LaMelo Ball, even if they draft Scoot Henderson. So that's not really like a thing we need to look at. This is all about Scoot, and the Pelicans don't want LaMelo Ball. So make sure you become an everydayer. Listen Monday through Friday and support the channel. And support the channel by commenting down below on YouTube. So, what's a deal look like? We're going to use either Zion or BI, and we're going to kind of use them interchangeably here because next season, they make basically the exact same amount of money, and it makes it very simple. Zion's making $33.5 million. Brandon Ingram's making $33.8, or the numbers are flipped. Doesn't matter. That's basically the exact same amount of money. Supposedly, the Charlotte Hornets are demanding a lot for that second overall pick. That's how valuable Scoot Henderson is. And when you hear all of that stuff of Charlotte really likes Brandon Miller, they're going to take Brandon Miller, they don't like the fit with Scoot Henderson and LaMelo Ball, you don't think about that at the top of the draft. They're taking Scoot Henderson. I will bet money they're taking Scoot Henderson. I'll do that over on FanDuel actually today. They're going to take Scoot Henderson. And he supposedly just worked out for them and had an incredibly impressive workout, and that's swaying them. Workouts for the top couple of draft prospects don't actually sway anybody. You know what your board is, and you just want to see these guys and get to know them in person a little bit. It doesn't dramatically sway anything. Scoot Henderson is an insane athlete. We have seen that. It shouldn't take a workout to prove that to you. If that's the case, fire that whole front office. So they're going to take Scoot Henderson. This is so exactly the same thing as Jabari Smith Jr. last year. It's going to be Jabari Smith. Like a month of it was going to be Jabari Smith Jr. And then 15 hours before the draft, the betting lines changed, and all of a sudden it was actually Paolo Banchero, and it had been Paolo Banchero the whole time, and they were just throwing everybody off. Not that they even needed to with the number 1 overall pick. Like, what's the point of that? Anyway, that's what's happening here. I bet very good money on that is what's happening here. So they're going to take Scoot Henderson, and they know that pick is very valuable because teams like Scoot Henderson, and not just the Pelicans, are calling up. So you look at this and you go, well, yeah, no, Zion should be the centerpiece of this deal, and you got to give us more stuff. Charlotte's not viewing it as that. They're viewing it as the number 2 overall pick is more valuable than Zion Williamson or Brandon Ingram. And I don't know which one they like better. I don't think we really know either. I think Zion's the more talented player, and you listen to anyone really talk about this, and they're like, no, Zion's who you do this for, not Brandon Ingram. And that's not even a knock on Brandon Ingram. Brandon Miller's ceiling is probably a Brandon Ingram-esque player. So why draft Brandon Miller if you could just get Brandon Ingram at, 26 years old, still young, and put him on your team? But I think they're really high on Scoot and know that Scoot Henderson, as everyone seems to think, is going to be a really, really great lead guard in the NBA. So they're going to be asking for a lot. So you're not just going to give up Zion Williamson. You're going to have to take back a bad contract, likely in the form of Terry Rozier, who has 3 more years remaining at 20-something million plus each year. He's 20 years old, not a bad player. I wouldn't call him great. 21.1 points per game last season, 5 assists. All right, doesn't shoot the 3 ball particularly well, but you look at his contract and you're like, oh, I don't know if I want that on the books. $23.2 million next year, 25 the year after that, then 26.6 in the final year of his deal, which is the 25-26 season. The Pelicans are trying to do this partially to get off of money. Now you're adding more money. Less than Zion, but you're also putting Scoot's numbers on the books too, so it ends up working out to being the kind of same thing. That doesn't solve the problem for New Orleans. On top of that, Charlotte's going to probably want a guy like Herb Jones or Trey Murphy included in the deal too, and maybe another future first. So you're trading Zion, Herb Jones, a future first for Scoot Henderson, Terry Rozier, and like maybe 1 or 2 other things involved in here, right? Like maybe you need to include a guy like whichever one of the Martin twins that they have on the team, who's also on a 3-year contract with them, Cody Martin. It's not great. You're not going to get Mark Williams from them, who they drafted in the first round last year. I don't think they want to include Gordon Hayward in this deal. He's an expiring, making $30-something million. New Orleans would like that because you can either just flip him or let him expire off your books, and all of a sudden that's a bunch of money saved. But I think the Charlotte Hornets, who know they won't be that competitive next year, even with Zion and LaMelo Ball, you're still like 7th, 6th seed, something like that. They're probably content to let Gordon Hayward expire or just trade him for an asset. So you're looking at Terry Rozier, let's say Cody Martin, and Scoot Henderson for Zion, a future pick, maybe even 14 in this draft, and Herb Jones. This looks like it's just too much, doesn't it? It looks like it's almost too much for both sides. Like that, I don't feel comfortable giving up that much for Scoot Henderson when, okay, maybe it works out with Zion and maybe this is a wake-up call for Zion Williamson and maybe he puts everything together. And if you're Charlotte and you really like that a lot, that's a big risk in Zion Williamson that can blow up in your face and set you back. And so when you start to think about what these trades look like, you're like, oh, this is kind of tough to really make it make sense. If it could be Zion for Gordon Hayward in the second overall pick, yeah, I think that's a fair deal, and you could argue that that's good for everybody there. But it's not going to just be that due to the way that teams, Charlotte, Portland potentially, if for whatever reason Charlotte takes Brandon Miller at 2, value Scoot Henderson in the way the league values Scoot Henderson. So this gets expensive quickly. And at a certain point, because the Pelicans aren't desperate this year, they might be like, that's too much. You want Zion, 2 first-round picks, and Trey Murphy? They're going to be like, no way. They're going to be like, we're done. We don't need to do this. So even if they're willing to include one of Zion or Brandon Ingram, it's still really tough to make a deal actually work that feels fair for both sides. And that's where I think, you're going to need a lot of negotiations, might go up to the day of the draft. And I don't know if it's necessarily going to get resolved in the next couple of days. Like we might need to wait till, what is it now, basically a week away, something like that. So it's tough to find a deal and get it done. And that's partially born from the fact of what we talked about in the first segment. Pelicans aren't desperate. It's not like they're shopping these guys around. They're very content keeping them. And we know the team could be very good if healthy. And that's the big question. There's risk on both sides of this. Both sides of this. Let's talk a little bit more about the risk coming up next, and along with a Portland trade, which I think is actually even more difficult than a trade with Charlotte, but could get a little bit more interesting. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, breaking down everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. And now for your second listen, go listen to Locked On's NBA mock draft special. It's here and it's bigger than ever. Follow along with the entire first round. It's a 6-episode ultimate mock draft experience only Locked On can deliver. All of our hosts make the pick. They give you a minute or two on why they made that pick. You can go see who I picked for the Pelicans at 14. We'll do a show about that and kind of the process in the draft and that mock draft. Maybe we'll actually do that tomorrow. That's a great idea of how that draft went, what my thinking was there, and why I went in the direction I did. And maybe it shed some insight because these people know their teams better than pretty much anyone else. All episodes are available now on Locked On NBA Big Board on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. So make sure that is your second listen today. And make sure Locked On Pelicans is your first listen and that you are an everydayer, and so you know what's going on around the team because we cover it all here like nobody else does. And today we're talking about how a trade can be kind of difficult even if the Pelicans are willing to include Brandon Ingram or Zion Williamson in a deal, even if they really want Scoot Henderson. Charlotte, it's still kind of tough because they want a lot, and they rightfully should want a lot. And maybe you can negotiate them down. There's a lot of posturing in the media right now for like, no, you got to give us a lot. There's no hard deadline yet to get something done. So until you get closer to that, yeah, ask for a lot. You can always come down later. And there's risk for everybody. Look, Zion's a risky player to take a flyer on, in a sense, even though we know the talent, even though we know he's 22 and his MVP level talent. Hadn't played. There's questions about the maturity and all of that. Brandon Ingram, there's questions about some of that stuff too. That's not a great, trade asset necessarily. Team still would do it, but you get what I'm saying. There's risk in drafting Scoot Henderson. What if he doesn't work out? Doesn't have a 3-point shot. Is that going to be a big problem? I think he's pretty close to a can't-miss prospect, but we've seen that before with guys, and turns out did miss. So there's risk on both sides. So if you feel they should trade Zion or BI, great. If you feel they shouldn't, also great. Everyone is correct on this, by the way. So let's look at a deal with the Portland Trailblazers. This is tougher. And I went on the Locked On Blazers podcast yesterday, the day before, talked with Mike Richmond, one of my favorite people of Locked On, by the way. Just like a happy, awesome, fun dude. I just dig that guy's vibe. we were talking about it, and we might have him and some of the Charlotte guys on the show too to discuss it, just kind of running out of time to do all of that with some of the other things that I want to talk about too. And so you look at a trade with Portland, and he said any deal with them for Brandon Ingram or Zion Williamson, and he agreed that Zion Williamson is the one that you want. Teams clearly value Zion over Brandon Ingram. Just again, it's terms of pure talent and everything when it comes to that. You would need to include Anthony Simons in a trade. You have to, because the money just won't work otherwise. You probably need to include some other things too. And if all of a sudden Scoot Henderson is available at 3 and teams are calling down the door, that price goes up. This is going to be an expensive trade for the New Orleans Pelicans. Simons, not bad. He's on a very similar contract to Terry Rozier, 3 more years, $24 million next year, $25.8 the next, $25.9 the year after that. Final year, $25, $26, $27.678 million. He's young. He is 24. Just turned 24, 21.1 points per game last season, 4.1 assists. He shot 37.7% from 3. He's a career 38.7% shooter. Those are good numbers. He's on a fair deal. But I don't think you're going to run him in the backcourt with CJ McCollum, so you're likely looking to reroute him. So now this gets a little bit more complicated, and this is also true when it comes to the Charlotte Hornets. Okay, you can put Simons in the deal. You might need to include some other salary too. Then maybe do you want to include, to try and weight the deal in your favor without giving up a pick, a guy like Jonas Valanciunas, because Portland needs a center? Do they send Yusuf Nurkic back? Do you even want that? No, you don't. But is that the way to get the deal done? And as you start to build this Portland trade out, all of a sudden you're trading like half the rosters because salary has to match. Okay, so we include JV. And now they've got to include somebody, and now it's off again, and that doesn't still feel kind of right in terms of players and talent. So maybe we include a guy like Najee Marshall. He actually said he wanted in the deal, and I was like, sure, I like Najee, but sure, take him if it means the Pelicans can get their guy and it saves them some sort of other asset. And all of a sudden you're trading 6 players from Portland, 6 players from New Orleans, and like that's just unrealistic and not how it works. So you see this, it's complicated, but it also is then the trade after the trade. And I should have said this earlier, and I should have said this in the Portland part, or in the Charlotte part. You get Terry Rozier. You don't want Terry Rozier on the team. You don't want him playing and getting minutes and taking minutes away from a guy like Dyson Daniels or some of the other younger players. You want to reroute Terry Rozier. Well, is that easy to do? Is it easy to reroute Gordon Hayward? Is it easy to reroute Anthony Simons? I think Simons would be the easiest out of all of those. But you then need to make sure you have that ready. Otherwise, you're going into the season where you still want to be competitive and you want Scoot Henderson to play. And now you have another guy that's like, I need minutes too, and you got to play me. And so it's not just the trade for Scoot, it's the trade after the trade for Scoot. And that's also a very important thing to consider and factor into all of this. And that's where this gets complicated. And the more you game it out on like the right kind of timeline in the scale of, okay, it doesn't just end here, we got to do more. Is that a road the Pelicans want to go down? Are they like, no, we'll just stick with our team and we don't need to do that much because, well, if we can't reroute or trade away Terry Rozier, we can't trade away Anthony Simons for stuff we want, we're stuck with a suboptimal roster, and that's not ideal either because they still do want to try and be competitive. So when I look at this, it's not the easiest thing, is it? It's not the easiest thing to try and figure out. And that might mean a deal doesn't get done. This is not a cut and dry situation. And I do think the Pelicans have some leverage on their side by saying, we're good. He's going to call Zion available, and they're going to say, no, Zion's not available. Pacers are going to call, and they'll be like, what do you want? You can't have Tyrese Halliburton. Pelicans are going to be like, goodbye. Hang up the phone on them. It only works for a very small set of very specific circumstances. We'll see if those come to fruition or not. I'm not sure. It's a long shot. Doesn't mean that they're not considering it. Doesn't mean they wouldn't do it. Doesn't mean they don't even want to do it or mean they want to do it. Doesn't mean they don't want to do it. Doesn't mean it's going to happen though. But if nothing happens, they're going to say, oh no, we're never doing that. It's not true. We know what's going on here. So we'll see if there's any breakthroughs or if these breaking points are just too much to get a deal done. Let me know what you think. What's the most you would give up in a trade involving Zion or BI? You comfortable including other first-round picks? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. And that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. I'll be back with you all tomorrow to talk about the Locked On Podcast Network's NBA mock draft, your team every day. Something you can only get here on Locked On, and I'll explain kind of what was going on and what my thoughts were as we did this live, where it was like, make your pick. We were all in a Zoom chat hanging out together. It's pretty cool. It was really fun. Make sure you give that a watch, and we'll talk about it in Friday's episode of Locked On Pelicans, and I'll see y'all then. Oh, wait, I got to hit the outro. Hold on. It's got a fancy graphic. Here you go.